They had been separated from the main group at the second facility. Not harshly, just moved to one side, names checked against a different list, told to wait while the others were processed through. There were 7 of them. One had lost his left arm below the elbow at the Ardennes. One walked with a permanent limp from a wound that had been treated too late. 2 had partial hearing loss from artillery. 1 had a back injury that meant he could not lift anything above his waist. And 1, the youngest, perhaps 19, had lost the sight in his left eye. They had learned, in every facility they had passed through, that men who couldn't work fully were a problem nobody wanted to solve. So they had learned to make themselves invisible, to carry their own bags, manage their own difficulties, ask for nothing. Asking drew attention. Attention led to questions about capability, and questions about capability in a prisoner facility never ended well. The one with the missing arm had been carrying his own bag since Belgium. He had developed a way of balancing it against his body that worked well enough on flat ground. He had not asked anyone for help. He did not intend to. Then the American private beside him reached over and picked up the bag without being asked. He said simply, "I've got it." The man looked at him. The private was already walking, bag in hand, not waiting for a response, not making anything of it, just carrying the bag. The man stood there for a moment. Then he followed. At the front of the line, the American sergeant had the list and was going through it name by name. When he reached the 7th, he stopped. He looked at the group as a whole. 7 men, 7 different limitations, 7 different ways of moving through the world carefully. Then he said something to the translator. The translator was quiet for a moment before repeating it in German. He said, "The sergeant says, you are not a problem to be managed. You are men who need different assignments. There is a difference." Nobody moved. Not because they were defiant, because in every camp they had passed through, nobody had made that distinction before. The camp sat in a converted school building outside a small town in northern France. It had been running for 6 weeks, mostly infantry, supply personnel, the administrative remnants of units that had dissolved in the final collapse. The facility was organized around work details. The surrounding farms needed labor. The roads needed maintenance. The camp itself needed constant upkeep. Work assignments were the rhythm of the place, and the rhythm was built around the assumption that men could work. The sergeant's name was Hadley. He was 38 from Minnesota and had spent 20 years before the Army managing a hardware warehouse, which had given him a particular skill for looking at a collection of things and figuring out what each one was actually good for. He had not been assigned to disability management. There was no such assignment. He had simply looked at the list and looked at the 7 men and decided that the question was not whether they could work, but what work they could do. He spent the first afternoon going through the assignments methodically. The man with the missing arm had been a bookkeeper before the war. Hadley put him in the administrative office, tallying supply inventories, keeping records, work that required one good hand and a mind that organized things clearly. The man with the limp was assigned to the workshop, seated work, repairing equipment. He could sit for hours and his hands were steady. The 2 with hearing loss went to the kitchen, where the noise level was already high enough that the difference barely mattered and where most communication was done through gesture anyway. The man with the back injury was given the lightest outdoor assignment, maintaining the camp garden, work that required bending forward rather than lifting, which he could manage without pain. The youngest one, the one with one working eye, was assigned to the translator's office, helping sort documents. He had sharp attention to detail, and the work required stillness and focus, which he had learned to cultivate as compensation for the loss of depth perception. The 7th man, an older corporal with hands so damaged by frostbite that he had limited grip strength, was put in the laundry. The work was hot and repetitive, and required only that you could move your arms, which he could. Each assignment had been thought about. This was visible to the men receiving them, and the visibility of it was its own thing, a different kind of discomfort from the kind they were used to. The bookkeeper was the one who noticed it first. He came to the administrative office on the first morning and found a desk set up for a left-handed person, the lamp on the right, the paper stack on the left, the pen already uncapped and positioned where his remaining hand would reach it naturally. Nobody had announced this. It had simply been done. He stood at the desk for a long time before sitting down. That evening, the 7 men gathered in their corner of the barracks. The bookkeeper said, "Someone moved the lamp." The man with the limp said, "What?" The bookkeeper said, "At the desk. Someone moved the lamp to the right side, for the arm." Nobody said anything for a moment. The youngest one said, "The chair at my desk has a higher back than the others. I didn't ask for it. It was just there." The man with the back injury said, "My tools are all laid out at waist height. no reaching down. They looked at each other. The man with the missing arm said, "They looked at the list before we arrived." Someone had looked at the list, 7 men, 7 limitations, and had gone through the assignments and the workspaces and had made small adjustments, each one specific, none of them announced. The man with the limp said, "Why would they do that?" Nobody answered. The bookkeeper looked at his remaining hand. He said, "In the last camp there was a man who had lost both legs below the knee. They put him on kitchen duty standing up. He lasted 4 days before he couldn't stand anymore. They put him in isolation for not completing his assignment." Silence. He said, "They didn't look at the list there." The youngest one said, "Maybe they did and didn't care what it said." The bookkeeper said, "Maybe. Or maybe they looked at something different, not what he couldn't do, what they needed him for." He looked at the lamp on his desk in his mind. The specific, unremarkable gesture of someone who had thought, "This man has one arm and the lamp should be on the other side." One practical thing. Done without announcement. Weeks passed, the assignments held. The work was real, not make work, not the performance of occupation. The bookkeeper's records were used. The laundryman's output was measured. The garden produced food the camp ate. Each man was doing something that mattered in the small, functional way that things matter when they are actually needed. The man with the limp had a problem with his chair in the 3rd week. He went to Hadley directly. He had simply walked to the sergeant's office and knocked before he had fully decided to. Hadley looked at him. He said, "What's wrong with the chair?" The man explained. Hadley went to the workshop with him, found a wooden block to raise the chair, tested the height, adjusted it twice until the man said it was right. He did this in 10 minutes. Then he went back to his office. The man sat in the modified chair. The pressure was gone. He thought about the man with no legs in the last camp, 4 days standing, isolation for failing the assignment. He thought about what Hadley had said at the beginning. "You are not a problem to be managed. You are men who need different assignments." He had been a problem to be managed for so long that the category had started to feel like a fact about him rather than a decision someone had made. He looked at the raised chair. Someone had made a different decision. He picked up his tools and went back to work. The 7 men were eventually transferred together. Hadley had written something in their files that kept them as a unit. They only discovered this later, when they arrived at the next facility and were processed as a group rather than separated. None of them knew what he had written. But the bookkeeper thought about it sometimes. He thought, 1 sentence probably. Something practical. Something that described 7 men in terms of what they could do rather than what they couldn't. He thought, that is a different kind of list. He had been on many lists. This was the first one that had felt like it was written about a person rather than a problem,